Good evening. My name is Carolyn Ivanoff, and I am a retired high school administrator, independent historian, and author. My book, called We Fought at Gettysburg, is going to be discussed this evening. And in the course of that discussion, we're going to look at several men whose photographs you see here with regard to their experiences before, after, and during the Battle of Gettysburg, and some of their firsthand accounts. And we're going to look at how they react, their experiences, their friends, and what happens to them. And not only that, but how their lives and sacrifices are important to our lives today. And so to begin the program, you can see the faces before you. The title of the book is We Fought at Gettysburg. And the program follows the members of the 17th Connecticut Regiment through the three-day Battle of Gettysburg and beyond in July 1863. Based on the accounts that these men left of their experiences, this presentation focuses specifically on the stories of the wounded, the caregivers, and the honored dead. Through firsthand accounts of these citizen soldiers, we in the 21st century come as close as possible to seeing what these soldiers themselves saw and thought and felt on the battlefield and the aftermath of Gettysburg. The battle was 3 days, and the survivors would live with it for the rest of their lives. Following their experiences in this program, we see that their sacrifices and experiences still touch our lives today. Their sacrifices were not in vain. War is the worst experience in the human condition, and yet it brings great social, technological, and medical examples. The following narrative accounts are selected from my book, We Fought at Gettysburg, about the 17th Connecticut and the Gettysburg Campaign. The book is based on a manuscript by Private William Warren. It's a remarkable, unpublished, multi-volume, massive, rambling collection in the Bridgeport History Center, Bridgeport, Connecticut. From the end of his service to the end of his life, Warren collected firsthand accounts from the survivors of the regiment. He never published the regimental history that he dreamed of writing. And these narratives depict a wide range of personal incidents from the survivors, the wounded, the prisoners, men who witnessed the death of their comrades, men who nursed their wounded friends in hospitals, and men who soldiered on after the battle. The accounts portray the entire range of personal encounters and experiences at Gettysburg, and these men speak not only for themselves, but for thousands of other men at this battle who experienced what they experienced. And through them, we can see the battle through their eyes, read their words, try to understand what they felt, thought, and went through at the Battle of Gettysburg. So, the question always arises, why should we care what these men wrote? What can we learn from them? What light can these individual citizen soldiers shed on the most written about battle in the American Civil War? Well, from reading their accounts, I know they fought the battle hungry and thirsty. Many of them were impaired from the forced marching and lack of food and water before they even reached the battlefield on July 1st. Once the battle began, there was very little water, no supplies except for ammunition, little or no food, and many went from marching column right onto the battle line. They marched to the sound of the guns, and they marched right out of their shoes and fought the battle in bare feet. It's estimated that about 50% of the Army of the Potomac was barefoot at the battle, which is a remarkable thing that many people don't associate with the Union Army. We mostly associate barefootedness with the Confederates. How do I know all this? Well, these guys tell us in their writing. You know, when Kent Masterson Brown wrote his great book about Meade and his leadership at Gettysburg, he really researched this about the army was pretty debilitated, and we have a picture from General Meade's standpoint of a debilitated army that could not function to do the commanding general's bidding after a hard-won battle. Well, the book does not focus on leadership or the great men at Gettysburg, but it focuses on these citizen soldiers who suffered these hardships and described them. And their words do help us understand our history. Well, let's begin. On June 28th, General George Gordon Meade takes command of the Army of the Potomac. And Meade immediately orders his corps commanders to send all wagons except ammunition and ambulances to the rear, including all medical supplies. Major Jonathan Letterman, medical director for the Army of the Potomac, tries to salvage what he knows is going to be a horrible situation. He orders all medical supplies and wagons brought up to Westminster, Maryland, 20 miles from Gettysburg. That was supposed to be Westminster was supposed to be the supply line for the Pipe Creek line that Meade originally thought he would have to fight on. When the battle erupts July 1st at Gettysburg, medical personnel had only what they carried or what was in their ambulances to treat the wounded. The lack of medical supplies created a horrendous situation, with very few medical supplies within 20 miles from where they were desperately needed. Of course, this horrific situation for casualties and medical personnel was just a nightmare. And the one saving grace at this battle was that the reforms that Letterman had pioneered, that were collectively called the Letterman system, were firmly in place at Gettysburg. You know, after Waterloo in 1815, it took 10 days to gather the wounded and treat them. In contrast, the day after the Battle of Gettysburg ended, not one wounded man of the great number who had fallen was left on the ground. And this is a tribute to Jonathan Letterman, the medical director of the Army of the Potomac. In what became known as the Letterman system, he organized a vast system of military hospitals that cared for the wounded. He implemented an ambulance corps, an evacuation system, a field hospital system that allowed for the rapid care and evacuation of wounded soldiers. Letterman's triage protocols for organizing the wounded in two categories: the mortally wounded, they were made comfortable and put off to the side. The slightly wounded were left to wait for treatment, and surgical cases were seen to as quickly as possible. These medical and transport systems were unprecedented. Letterman standardized medical supplies and equipment carried by each regimental surgeon. The treatment at forward field dressing stations and field hospitals were the precursors to the modern MASH units. Letterman's divisional hospital plan also standardized the job for each surgeon, assistant surgeon, general assistants, and dressers in the field to provide efficient care for the wounded. What are the implications of this system for us today in the 21st century? Well, the Letterman system, created during the Civil War, procedures of triage, evacuation, emergency care, standardization of supplies are utilized today worldwide in mass casualty situations, and Jonathan Letterman is regarded as the father of battlefield medicine. Well, this book deals with the 17th Connecticut at Gettysburg. The 17th Connecticut was part of the 1st Division, 2nd Brigade of the 11th Corps. The 11th Corps had been routed by Stonewall Jackson's Confederate blitz at Chancellorsville in May. Many of the Corps were foreign-born German immigrants who faced much prejudice in the Army of the Potomac. They were referred to as the Dutch Corps, and they became the scapegoats for the catastrophic defeat at Chancellorsville, where they were named the Flying Dutchmen and Howard's Cowards for General Howard, the 11th Corps commander. As these men slogged their way north to the Battle of Gettysburg, they were determined to put the humiliation of Chancellorsville behind them. Unfortunately, General Barlow, their division commander, would roll his men out to a knoll that would afterward bear his name. General Barlow placed his woefully outnumbered division in a salient that the Confederate blitz attacking them would crush in a vise, and the parallels to Chancellorsville a month before were tragic. In my book, throughout the program, I'll refer to Barlow's Knoll. This was originally called Blocker's Knoll for the farmers that own the land. The knoll is marked today with a sign that says Barlow Knoll. No possessive apostrophe, as it was not owned by General Barlow. But when the soldiers wrote about their experiences after the war, they referred to this as Barlow's Knoll, and I have taken my cue from them. In the book and throughout the program, I will refer to Barlow's Knoll. The 17th Connecticut Monument you see on the left upper portion of the slide is where the 17th Connecticut Monument is placed. It was placed in 1885. The flagpole was placed in 1885, marking the horrific decapitation of the death of Colonel Fowler in combat. The opposite 1889 shaft, marking the second day's fight on East Cemetery Hill, and the three contemporary woodcuts of Barlow's Knoll, the artillery duel on Barlow's Knoll, the night fight on East Cemetery Hill, and a sketch created of Barlow's Knoll in the middle of the slide were all included so that we would get a picture of what these men saw. Now, the implications for us today in the 21st century is that although many places on the Gettysburg battlefield today have been preserved so that the 1863 view sheds of what the soldiers saw are visible to battlefield visitors today. When you visit portions of the positions of the 17th Connecticut, the 1863 views are forever obliterated. And the ability to see their positions as the soldiers saw them in 1863 is impossible. East Cemetery Hill in front of the 17th Connecticut Monument is some of the most churned up and changed land on the battlefield. All of the 17th Connecticut survivors who left accounts mentioned from Barlow's Knoll, the old oak tree that marked their position in 1863. Well, by 1884, when they erected their monument, the tree had been destroyed in a storm. And the veterans all returning to mark the place where their monument would be, pirated any wood dug out the roots as souvenirs. And at the top of this slide, you can see a piece of the wood of that old oak tree that the veterans recovered, housed at the Connecticut Historical Society. This program is going to focus on the aftermath. And so I wanted to show some of the 11th Corps hospitals that these men would be taken to. And all of the hospitals served both Union and Confederate wounded. They are clockwise from left to right: the Alms House, the German Reformed Church, and the public school on High Street, the Josiah Benner Farm House and Barn on the Old Harrisburg Road across Rock Creek, and Camp Letterman, the Tent Hospital. In the center is the George Spangler Farm, 11th Corps Hospital, which existed from July 1st through August 7th until all remaining soldiers were either sent away to Eastern hospitals on the railroad, or those who could not be moved were at Camp Letterman. Camp Letterman was at one point the largest hospital in the world. It was a tent hospital, and it officially closed on November 20th, the day after Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Now, after the Battle of Gettysburg, it's very difficult for us to understand what it was like. But after the battle, the atmosphere is overpowering with putrid air polluted by dead horses and dead men, and the vast amount of human waste and effluvia. Dead human and horse flesh rot in the July heat. Torrential summer rains on July 4th uncover and expose shallow graves. Hospitals are charnel houses of amputated limbs and maggot-infested wounds. Flies, millions of them, blacken the landscape. The thick, sickening atmosphere was inescapable and intensely palpable. And early relief workers, as they entered hospitals, would have smelled them before they saw them. The smells of sweat, blood, urine, feces, gangrene, and rotting flesh of human and horses clogged the atmosphere, making it almost too difficult to believe. What were Civil War hospitals like? What did these men who were wounded or tended friends, what did they write about? Well, hospitals were loud, unruly, disturbing areas of sensory overload. In addition to the inescapable odors and frightening sights, in their misery and distress, the wounded shouted, groaned, cried, screamed. A Christian Commission delegate reported that the men were in terrible condition. They lay upon the damp ground, many of them with nothing under them. There was an unusual large number of amputation, the stumps lying upon the ground. Many of the men, perhaps most of them, were in want of clothing. Suitable food was not to be had. The surgeons were overworked. The rebels, most of them severely wounded, were shrieking continually, crying for assistance. Destitute of clothing, many of them naked, lying in the mud, cursing, praying, begging their visitors to put an end to their suffering. And this is what it's like in these hospitals, in town and on the farms. Several of these hospitals can still be seen today. The George Spangler Farm, of course, is beautifully restored by the Gettysburg Foundation. The Almshouse complex is gone. The German Reformed Church and the High Street School are still visible today on the corner of Stratton and High. The Josiah Benner Barn and the house have been restored by the Park Service. Well, let's talk about the hospitals and doctors. This is Dr. Robert Hubbard. He is the surgeon of the 17th Connecticut, and he is also the medical inspector of the 11th Corps. He's a 36-year-old former physician from Bridgeport, Connecticut, leaves a wife and a small child behind. And he is left behind after the armies depart. We have several firsthand accounts of men who witnessed Dr. Hubbard treating casualties on the field at Barlow's Knoll and also behind the cemetery gates on East Cemetery Hill throughout the battle. After the battle, again, he's left behind, and it is he who is responsible for getting casualties onto the railroad cars after the bridges over Rock Creek are repaired, because they can't just keep everybody at Gettysburg. They have to get them out of there as quickly as possible. And it's Hubbard who sends them away to hospitals all over the East Coast. Hubbard is an excellent, excellent surgeon, and he is a very, very high level operator. But let's talk about that. When we talk about medical advances made because of the Civil War, we talked about the Letterman system, triage, evacuation, anesthesia. We must understand almost every surgery during the war is done under anesthesia. but seldom mentioned as a medical advance, is that it's because of the Civil War that surgery becomes a regular practice in American medicine. Civil War doctors were not butchers. They were excellent doctors, but one of the great tragedies of the war is that it occurred before Pasteur and Lister began their work. There was no germ theory, and infection and disease killed 3 times as many soldiers as battle wounds. The term surgeon is used for all military doctors during the Civil War, but by Letterman's orders, by 1863, only the best surgeons or operators were doing surgery. Other doctors who were not chosen operating surgeons were dressing wounds, administering anesthesia, post-surgical care, treating the sick, managing hospitals. Only the best surgeons were operating. Amputation was the most performed surgery because it saved lives, not because it was easy for these doctors. One of the biggest myths of the Civil War was that surgeries were conducted without anesthesia. But getting back to amputation, why so many? Civil War surgeons understood amputation took a complex wound that could not be treated and created a less complex wound that could be. And this less complex wound would extend the chances for the patient's survival. Now, today we are seeing in the Mideast these wounds by IEDs, these pressure cooker bombs from the Boston Marathon attack. These wounds are the type of wounds that resemble the wounds of the Civil War. And today, even today, such wounds cannot be treated with all of the miracles and progress of modern medicine. And so amputation has become again a life-saving surgery necessary for the treatment of such wounds. Most physicians in pre-Civil War America had little or no experience in the treatment of gunshot wounds, little or no surgical experience. The Civil War would change medicine forever in America. These doctors were good doctors, committed healers, and it is the war that would create good surgeons. Surgery before the war was infrequently used as a treatment, except in medical schools and extreme emergencies. Surgeons learn through volume and repetition, and the Civil War tragically provided both. During the war, tens of thousands of surgeries were performed, and the most performed surgery, again, would be amputation to save lives, and it would be performed under anesthesia. The implications for us in the 21st century. It's because of the Civil War that surgery became a standard medical practice wherever and whenever needed by Americans. Medical specialization is born with Letterman's orders that only the best operators perform surgery. Skill, not rank or seniority, would be the prevailing factor in surgical care. And Civil War surgeons would go on to pioneer reconstructive and plastic surgery to deal with disfiguring wounds. Experimental surgery would be pioneered in attempts to deal with head and chest wounds, almost always deemed mortal and left untreated. Unfortunately, it was not until after an understanding of germ theory and the work of Pasteur and Lister that such pioneering attempts to save lives would take root. But Civil War surgeons would become the cutting edge. Let's talk about some of the wounded and what happened to them. The implications of their treatment were for us today. Corporal Aaron Lee is going to be wounded just outside of the almshouse on the field, coming off Barlow's Knoll. He would be wounded in the thigh, and he would be taken to the almshouse, which would serve as a hospital. Confederates were in charge of the field. Aaron Lee became a wounded prisoner. and he left an account of his wounding. On July 1st, after the Confederate onslaught rolled over the 11th Corps on Barlow's Knoll, he would write after he was terribly wounded. After the first flash of battle had passed away, I was in that state of mind. I could view 2 lines of battle calmly. My only thoughts were those of gaining a toehold to create another battle line and to stand on it. But before reaching the outskirts of the city, a mini ball went zip through my my thigh. I stepped in back of a building where some mounted officers stood, and they directed me to the almshouse and to hurry or I would be taken prisoner. After the Confederate withdrawal, Lee, Corporal Lee was taken to the Spangler farm, and then he was evacuated from Gettysburg. He wrote to his father, I was sent to Philadelphia, arriving on the night of the 9th, and then for the first time, my wound was dressed. Gangrene set in, and I had a pretty tough time of it. The doctors gave me up and said I could not live, but I did not agree with them. I had made up my mind that I was going to pull through, and I did. And after getting so I could walk on crutches, the doctors wanted to transfer me to the Invalid Corps. But I rebelled and I got a furlough for 20 years. And I was taken to Knight Hospital in New Haven, Connecticut. And by this transfer, the Invalid Corps was treated of a recruit. And I returned to my regiment, St. Augustine, Florida, arriving on the 6th of June, 1864. Took him almost a year to recover from this wound. But what is this Invalid Corps that Lee does absolutely not want to be transferred to? Well, the Invalid Corps was created by Uncle Sam for incapacitated or wounded soldiers who were no longer fit for active service, and it put them in this corps to free up healthy soldiers to fight. Uncle Sam is reluctant to release any man who could continue to serve the Union cause. And these men would become clerks or guards or nurses in hospitals, but they did not like the invalid title, Invalid Corps. To a 19th century person, invalid, created a, a, a an impression that a man was no longer a valid person. We seldom use the term today, but it indicated in the 19th century that individuals were no longer whole, and the word was despised. And compounding this, the word invalid was the fact that Army shorthand for equipment inspected and condemned were the initials IC, the same as the Invalid Corps. So this is a problem for most people, and the government recognizes this, and so they do this public relations thing, and they rebrand the Invalid Corps the Veterans Reserve Corps. They want to boost the morale of the men who were serving in it. And the Invalid Corps is just not a popular thing, although many, many disabled and wounded men are transferred to it. And the Invalid Corps does excellent service for the Union Army. As Grant strips the defenses of Washington for his summer campaign in 1864, and Jubal Early comes calling at the nation's capital, on the outskirts of the nation's capital. The U.S. Capitol really is, it has no one to defend it, except these men who are called out, call out the Invalid Corps. And when one of the inspecting officer views the Veterans Reserve Corps assembled for the defense of the Capitol, he looks at the Veteran Reserve Corps commander and says, "Oh my God, will these men stand?" And the officer says, "Well, we cannot run away." Well, Despite all this, the Invalid Corps does good work for the Union Army. And many of these men do good service. Many wounded and disabled men served out their enlistments honorably and well. They contributed to the Union cause. The implications for us in the 21st century are today we seldom use terms like invalid or invalid when describing the disabled. And, you know, the Invalid Corps or Veterans Reserve Corps is one of the government's first attempts to create an active role for the disabled. And it proved for the most part a success. And today our society continues to grapple with the same questions of how to best provide for the disabled, how to eliminate prejudice toward them. Our attitudes toward the disabled will hopefully continue to evolve. We no longer consider the disabled invalid human beings, and we seldom use the word invalid. We as a society need to continue to create a better world and opportunities for all those who suffer from disabilities, both seen and unseen. Two witnesses, one building. This is the school on High Street. Still there today. It looks almost exactly the way it is, except the steeple is gone or the cupola is gone, but the bell is still at Unity Park. This building became a Union hospital. The Confederates were in possession of the town, and so the wounded in this building became Confederate wounded prisoners. And you can see two accounts about this building here. 22-year-old J. Henry Blakeman would, on July 2nd, he was wounded on Barlow Knoll on July 1st. He was shot through the left side, and he was taken to this prison hospital. On July 2nd, he would note that from the windows of our prison hospital, we saw the Louisiana Tigers form on the street and charge the 17th, and the 17th Regiment helped to repulse the charge with such slaughter on the evening of the 2nd. Private Justice Silliman, Company H, was also wounded day one on Barlow's Knoll. He was shot in the head, and the bullet scraped across his skull, knocked him out, gave him a heck of a headache, but he was able to be transferred to this prison hospital. He was ambulatory, and he was able to leave an account of what he saw July 3rd, 1863. And on the morning of the 3rd, the Confederate captors informed us that they had orders to shoot any of us that appeared at the windows. So in order to watch the battle, I climbed to the cupola, from which I had an excellent view of the field. And even at that height, the bullets were whistling around my ears, and the noise of shot and shell in the air resembled that of a mighty torrent. So we have one building still there today that is going to bear witness to the battle by two wounded men. Now, today, what's the implications for us when we go back to Gettysburg today? Well, the school's still on High Street, looking remarkably like it did in 1863 when it was a prison hospital. The views that these men witnessed and remembered, the formation of the Tigers in the street near the school, their attack toward the Union lines, the North Carolina troops assembling near Culp's farm, the view of combat from the streets of Gettysburg to the base of Culp's Hill on July 2nd, and then Justice Silliman's view of Pickett's charge on the 3rd. Well, I believe that all of these sight lines that these men saw in 1863 are totally obliterated. And these views are gone forever. This map shows you their positions and gives you an idea about why these men could see so much from where they were positioned. In the upper right-hand corner is Barlow's Knoll. where the men fought on the first day. And then the almshouse is visible below that along the Harrisburg Road. It would become the first one of the first field hospitals because it was right in the middle of the Union retreat toward town. And then you see the wounded would be transferred, or the ambulatory wounded would get to the church on the corner of Stratton and High, and the prison school hospital next door to the church on High Street. Below that, if you look below, you can see the 17th Connecticut position, and you could see how the men in the previous slide would have been able to watch the battle. Now, this is Captain Wilson French, and he is a wounded officer on Barlow's Knoll. As the Confederate onslaught is rolling toward them, Captain French has his sword above his head. He's issuing orders to his men, and he is clipped by an explosive shell in the elbow. He's immediately disabled. He's surrounded and captured by the Confederates, and as well as many other of the 17th Connecticut. He is ambulatory and directed by his Confederate captors to walk toward the town to the church hospital. On the way, he is met by Dr. Robert McEwen, who slits the sleeve of his coat, who administers aid in the field, stops the bleeding, and along with Captain French, they go toward the church hospital. Now, this slide it talks about what kind of shape these men are in and what kind of care they received. Captain French is accompanied by another prisoner. It's a private who stays with him, tries to tend to him. They enter the church hospital where amputations are taking place. Captain French is a candidate for amputation. The surgeons tell him they're going to amputate his arm, and he flat out refuses. Now, there's so much going on, they're not going to spend any time with a man who refuses surgical care. And so the private that is with him simply tries to keep the wound wet to try to keep it, functioning or administer some kind of first aid. Captain French is transferred to Spangler Farm Hospital. From there, transferred by Dr. Hubbard to the train station as soon as the railroad bridge is repaired across Rock Creek. And he is probably one of the first casualties out on the train on July 8th. He is an officer. He is ambulatory. Let's just get him out of Gettysburg and send him home to his wife, because that was probably the best treatment they could come up with. Captain French reaches Bridgeport, Connecticut on the evening, very late evening, probably the early morning of the 9th of July. He somehow gets from the train station to his house. He pounds on the door. His wife comes downstairs and sees her husband at the door unexpectedly, probably doesn't even have a casualty list yet. He's full of the mud and the blood of the battlefield. She takes him in. Of course, she's going to nurse him. And just to give you an idea what kind of shape these guys are in, she brings him in the house, and she can't get his boots off. French later writes that he has worn his boots for 2 weeks straight without taking them off before the battle. And when his wife tries to get them off, she can't. So she slits them with a knife and she begins to pull them off. And off with the boots come the skin and the toenails and everything on his legs and feet. And he is just a quivering raw mess, in addition to the wound. So she's successful in treating him. He gets well. He goes back to his regiment. But just to give you an idea about what these guys are going through, and it's just pretty much beyond what we can understand today. And we only know this through their writing and through their eyewitness accounts. Now, this is Private Henry Waite. Henry Waite is the young private who accompanies French as a prisoner nurse. He is not wounded in the battle, but he tries to help the other wounded prisoners in the Dutch Reformed Church and in the High Street School. Henry is he enlists at 16 years old. He enlists so young to try to escape a very abusive and alcoholic father. Dr. Hubbard knew the boy, took him under his wing, tried to keep him safe, probably made something of a medical cadet of him, and would ensure that Henry's pay went home to his mother and not his abusive alcoholic father. Henry is 17 at the Battle of Gettysburg. And after the war, he survives the war. He maybe his experiences with Dr. Hubbard and Captain French, treating the wounded and helping the sick, made an impression on him. After the war, he becomes an MD himself. And he not only becomes an MD, but he becomes an inventor of surgical equipment. And he becomes a wealthy man, and he has a son that follows in his footsteps. And together they go and they experiment and develop new kinds of surgical things. They're experimenting with electricity. Some of it is, could be termed by us kind of quack medical, but father and son start to experiment with fluoroscopes and x-rays. And it is Henry's son who will continue to invent, continue his father's work, and he will create the x-ray equipment that the AEF takes to Europe during the World War I, the portable x-ray equipment that is taken to Europe during World War I. You can see some of those early films. Now, this is something that Civil War doctors could not imagine. Doctors could not peer into the body during the Civil War. Anytime they were preparing for surgical procedure, they had to probe the body. What did they probe with? They probed with their finger. They probed with a metal rod. These x-rays were a miracle. We in the 21st century cannot ignore the Civil War's massive costs of life and damage that the nation suffered for years. Young men were robbed of their existence. Families were devastated. The entire nation is seared and suffers massive loss. And these young men would have contributed enormously if they had been allowed to live full lives. Their loss is tremendous, tremendous detriment to our nation. And we paid a high price for this war. But Henry Waite was one of the survivors. He lived to make tremendous contributions to medicine himself. He lived to have a son who followed his footsteps, and their lives made a difference for many Americans. And both men contributed to science and medicine that we still benefit from today. And today, in the 21st century, there is no diagnostic medicine without electricity and the x-ray devices that these men pioneered. So thank you. Thank you, Civil War veterans, for what you have done for us as you came home and remade your lives after a terrible war. Now, this is one thing about Americans. Grieving American families want their dead to come home. And they will go to great lengths for this to happen. This is Rufus Warren. He's mortally wounded on July 1st on Barlow's Knoll. He's going to suffer an amputation, and he's going to die at the Spangler Farm 11th Corps Hospital. Now, he is going to die without family around him. He's going to be buried in the graveyard at Spangler Farm. And word is going to reach his uncle that his nephew is, at the time he receives word, still alive. And his uncle, Hiram Nash, is going to undertake the arduous, terrible, difficult, expensive trip to Gettysburg to try to see his nephew alive. Unfortunately, when Hiram Nash arrives, his nephew has been put in the graveyard. Hiram Nash wants to bring his nephew home to Connecticut. So, what does he do? He goes through the entire process. And, his Rufus Warren's family and Dr. Nash are very lucky in one regard because they knew Rufus's fate, as tragic as it was. But during the Civil War, almost 40% of all the dead become unknown. And as hard as it is for us to believe in the 21st century, the government did not notify families when a soldier died or was killed in battle. That was left to friends or to company officers to notify the family. There's no centralized graves registration, there's no process for identification procedures or grave registration. Dog tags are a product of the 21st century and just simply don't exist. And also, the physical damage that occurred to men on the battlefield is often so horrific, it prevented identification even by those who knew the dead well. In mass casualty situations like Gettysburg, often no one remained to witness the death or write home to families. And this meant that many soldiers, fathers, sons, brothers, husbands simply vanished into the war and left grieving families, never to know their fate. So they are lucky in one hand, this family of Rufus Warren. They do know the fate of their uh, relative. What are the implications for the 21st century today? Well, as the Civil War is coming to a close, Clara Barton's so moved by this carnival of grief that engulfs the families of missing men that she seeks to and receives President Lincoln's permission to begin a missing soldiers office. No attempt had previously been made in the history to identify the unknown dead and bring closure to grieving families. Barton's efforts identified approximately 23,000 missing men and gave solace and closure to their families. After the war, the government began a systematic identification system for armed services. This is the 20th century. Dog tags, central graves registration, forensic identification for procedures and methods. Methods that notified families if a soldier was wounded, missing, dead. With the advent of DNA technologies and record keeping, hopefully there will never be another unknown soldiers. But Clara Barton's Civil War work is still being carried out today by the Department of Defense under the DPAA, the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency. The mission of the DPAA is to recover unaccounted for military personnel missing in action or prisoners of war from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Mideast, and other conflicts all over the world, and recovery operations to bring our American boys home. Well, how did you transport a body once you made the arduous trip and you found your dead loved one? What did you do? What did you have to do? Well, first of all, it's so expensive. Very few people could do it, but if you could, you did. And if you had the physical stamina needed to make such a horrific trip, well, one of the first things you had to do was get the body embalmed. And I know from the account that Dr. Nash left about his nephew's embalming, that Dr. Bunnell, the man you see in this picture, was the embalming surgeon for Rufus Warren. So the first thing you had to do was find the body, disinter it. Well, taking up the body cost $1. And then disinfection and a special coffin were $47. And that was the undertaker or the embalmer that you see here. And then you had to have this special coffin with the bodies shipped to the express office. All bodies went freight. And the freight for the trip to Connecticut was $23. So the total for just this portion of the recovery, the body's recovery, was $76. And that's an enormous amount of money. And just a portion of it, $1 in 1863 equaled $23.65 in our money. So, well, why embalming? Well, embalming was not unknown before the Civil War. As far back as ancient Egypt, human cultures had sought to preserve the dead. The Civil War would regularize embalming in America. During the war, it became necessary to embalm corpses before transporting them back home to families by freight. Unembalmed or poorly prepared corpses were a transportation nightmare on trains. They would leak, bodies would explode. It was just horrific. One 17th Connecticut family member returned to Gettysburg for his brother and left an account of the train having to halt to unload, just toss them off, rotting bodies as effluvia leaked sickeningly from their coffins. So only embalmed bodies were allowed to be shipped and transferred. And devastated families who wanted their dead to come home gladly paid for all these services. Besides allowing remains to be transported by rail, embalming also served the purpose of allowing loved ones to see for themselves the remains of their beloved dead. Obviously, no one wanted the wrong cadaver. So what are the implications for us today? Well, it's the Civil War that will regularize embalming practices for Americans. And, before the war, and mostly during it, Civil War families almost always dealt with death at home. After the war, the embalmer would evolve into the undertaker, and that man would make all the arrangements for fees and expenses, and then would this whole thing, the war, would transform death from a family ritual where the body was prepared at home, laid out at home, arrangements took place from home, to the modern practices that we have today, where an undertaker, funeral director coordinates the business of death. This is Corporal Alva Wilcox, and he is going to be wounded July 2nd on East Cemetery Hill. He's going to be horrifically shot through the shoulder. The bullet's going to enter his body. It's going to damage his spine. It's going to breach his lungs. He suffers what Civil War surgeons call a sucking wound. A wound that usually is not treated at all, but is one that you put the man off to the side. You make the man as comfortably as possible, and you allow death to overtake the person without much medical treatment at all. Well, there is a doctor on the Gettysburg battlefield, Dr. Benjamin Howard, who has Dr. Letterman's express position to seek out wounded who might qualify for this experimental surgery in treating these sucking wounds. And Dr. Howard is going to operate on about 10 men at Gettysburg. Alva Wilcox is going to suffer his surgery right in the field. It's probably at the field hospital that is in Evergreen Cemetery through those gates. We don't know where the hospital was, but the operating table is probably placed out in the open. Alva is brought to the operating table. Dr. Benjamin Howard will begin his experimental surgery. Howard calls this surgery a surgery for hermetically sealing the chest. And what it does is it tries to seal the chest so that the lung that has been punctured can begin to hold air again, and perhaps the man will have a chance at life. Well, implications for today's 21st century are that this experimental surgery is not going to have any effect whatsoever. The medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion, you can see Alva's case below in that box, is going to deem this surgical experimentation to have no effect on mortality. The reason is that not so much that the technique is at fault, but it is before germ theory is understood. And all of these men who are operated on die of sepsis. But implications for the 21st century, even though these men who underwent this experimental surgery are only footnotes in medical history, they are important, because Dr. Howard's procedure for treating chest wounds by sealing them ultimately leads to the standard practice for successful treatments of such wounds in modern medicine. And women are what the solution is going to become. Brave women who decide to leave their homes despite the stigma and decide to go into the field, go into the hospitals, to do what they need to do to take care of the soldiers, to volunteer their services. And this happens at Gettysburg when you have many, many volunteer nurses after the battle coming in to try to alleviate this mass casualty situation. James Middlebrook is a soldier nurse. He's incapacitated himself, but he's a soldier nurse at Spangler Farm. And he writes a remarkable letter on the 9th about women who are coming to Spangler Farm to nurse. And he writes, there are a number of ladies here every day who one belongs to some regiment and wears the soldier's uniform throughout. One lady was here with the American costume yesterday. Well, what's going on here? What's he describing? Well, he's describing a woman in a regimental bloomer costume that may indeed be Mary Tepe, who was nursing wounded at Gettysburg. She was 114th Pennsylvania. She was the vivandière, well known. Would go into combat with her men and would nurse them afterwards. And she was one farm over at Gettysburg and at the Weicker property, and she had access to Spangler. So she very well could have been, walking to Spangler to see what was what at another hospital. The other woman in the American costume, that's a 19th century term for bloomers, may have been Mary Walker. We don't know if it was for sure, but James Middlebrook definitely sees a woman in bloomers, and there were several at Gettysburg, including Mary Walker. Now, these two are remarkable women. Mary Tepe is honored with the Carney Cross, and Dr. Walker is going to be the only woman to receive a Medal of Honor. But what about these women? What about these women? These many, many women who nurse. We think perhaps almost 40,000 women nurse at some time, whether they're in hospitals or they nurse men in their homes or they volunteer or they're employed by the government. It just opens tremendous pathways for women. And we have to be thankful, because the implication for us today is the Civil War creates the profession of female nurses, and it becomes an honorable profession that we have all benefited from in our lives. Often unwanted and dismissed by male medical personnel, everywhere female nurses went in the war, survival rates went up. These women did what women did in the 19th century. They cleaned, they washed patients, they cooked nourishing foods, they comforted the wounded and the dying. Female nurses were never forgotten by grateful veterans that they served. And these women were shattering the stereotype that women were too delicate or fragile to handle the harsh realities of wartime and patient care. And this is their legacy, the profession today that we all benefit from, nursing. Now, I'm almost done, but I want to do this slide before I end. And this slide is, I think, one of the most interesting and one of many, many thousands of cases like it. There's an expression that I used to hear a lot when I was a kid. When I wanted to do something that was almost impossible, my mother would say, well, that will take an act of Congress. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard that expression, but that expression may refer to the congressional bills necessary for the passage of veterans' pensions. The Committee on Invalid Pensions, the Committee on Military Affairs, dealt with the reporting of general and special bills that authorize payments of pensions for the relief of soldiers, widows, and orphans of the Civil War. And you can see one of those congressional bills in front of you here. It's for James Roach. And on August 31st, 1865, Bridget Roach, whose husband James, 17th Connecticut, died in the regimental hospital on January 6, 1865. She applied for a widow's pension. Now, James Roach was an Irish immigrant. He died in the regimental hospital. Bridget applies for a pension, and nothing happens. Well, 26 years later, on June 16th, 1886, I find this bill, H.R. 228, titled For the Relief of James Roach. It's introduced in the first session of the 49th Congress, and the House Committee on Military Affairs recommends it for passage. And the purpose of the bill is to remove the charge of desertion standing against James Roach and allow his wife to receive her pension. Now, the bill stated the grounds upon which the claim for relief is based are as follows: that said Roach at the time of his alleged desertion was insane and not responsible for his acts, and then he continued to be insane until his death at the regimental hospital of inflammation of the brain. Now, like any good congressional bills, this has testimony from the regimental surgeon, testimony from his sergeant, testimony from his corporal, that Sergeant Roach was not responsible for his actions and his desertions. And it's the testimony of his corporal that is the most compelling, although all three pretty much say the same thing. And around the time of the Battle of Chancellorsville, Roach was kind of a high-strung guy, but he did his duty. But around the Battle of Chancellorsville, it was thought he was feigning sickness for the purpose of procuring a discharge. And then his behavior became quite erratic. And all of the testimony concurred that before Chancellorsville, he performed all the duties required of him, although he was of a nervous temperament, easily excited. But by the time of his death, his mind was utterly gone. And Corporal Perry stated that just before Chancellorsville and after, Roach exhibited mental derangement. Perry testified his actions were not those of a man of sound mind. And during the campaign through Virginia, previous to Gettysburg, the corporal believed Roach was of unsound mind after Gettysburg for the rest of his service. Perry is quoted that saying his insanity and death were caused by the necessities of his service. Combat drove him insane, in other words. And all of the testimony agrees to this. What are the implications for us today in the 21st century? Well, we'll never know what the true sacrifices and costs of war were to many who did not manifest physical wounds. The unseen costs of war take a tremendous toll on men in the Civil War as they do in every war. War's horrible effects on the mind as well as the body, the effects of post-traumatic stress, the distress of alcohol and addiction in coping with wounds, both seen and unseen, and all the hidden costs of war are not well understood. War is not kind to the human psyche. Wounds that are unseen can be as deep and as terrible as those that are visible. James Roach, Spine to Grave, lists him as lost at war. And so he was with so many others. Well, I hope that today with this program, I've done a small part in demonstrating that the service and sacrifices of the Civil War generation are relevant and meaningful to our generation today. And may we as Americans remember, honor, and preserve our history. Thank you for having me here today. And these are stories about people like us who lived, loved, lost, grieved, and suffered. For these citizen soldiers, their Army service remains the defining adventures of their lives, and their service is meaningful to us today, as are their stories. We can learn from them. This is my book, We Fought at Gettysburg, and it can be purchased at Amazon, anywhere books are sold, and it can be purchased from my publisher at Gettysburg Publishing. And thank you so much for having me. Have a wonderful evening.